like to introduce you Professor Arne Mooers, who will be giving a seminar today. Arne is from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and he's going to talk about a fascinating topic of valuing biodiversity and why we should do that and how we should do that. Which is, I think it's honestly, when I started studying biology, one of my first questions was like what the hell people had with the biodiversity and what's good about that, and I think it's actually good to deep into this question. So yeah, I think I'll give over to Arne.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Yeah, so this is the first time I've come to Prague. I've known about several of the groups here, but I've never been here, so it's quite exciting. So this is a longer talk. So it was a great opportunity. Well, I took it as an opportunity to put together a couple of different themes that I've been working on over the past quite a while, actually. The order in which I'm presenting it is not the order in which I did it. And so the second part actually motivated the first part, but I'm going to give you the first part first and then the second part, and then hopefully the third part. And because it's over a long period of time, there are many people that I've worked with. These are students. Professor Mike Steele is an applied mathematician in New Zealand who's done a lot of the theory that is sort of supported of this work. And Karen Tucker and I organized and I did a workshop almost a decade ago now, but also was quite influential in the beginning, certainly for the second part. Okay, so I'm going to start with this fellow who I never met, but he is Michael Soule. And he is considered the father of the discipline of conservation biology. He wrote the textbook, he wrote the original paper. Everyone refers to Soule when they refer to conservation biology. And the key tenet of conservation biology, and that's not me who says that, that's sort of generally considered, is this quote from What is Conservation Biology, published Biotic diversity has intrinsic value, irrespective of its instrumental or instrumental/utilitarian value. This is a normative postulate, so which means you have to believe this in order to go further. So it's something that you assume, and everybody should assume it in order to do your work. So this is interesting, and we'll talk about that perhaps later. But the part of the quote that caught my eye sort of initially, and certainly as I was getting into this and having trouble with some of this work, is that he then says species have value in themselves, a value neither conferred nor revocable, but springing from its long evolutionary heritage, which we will come back to, potential, its future, and even from the mere fact of its existence, right? So this is a very strong statement about why we care about biodiversity and why we care about a certain facet of biodiversity, a certain way, a certain metric of biodiversity, and that is species. So that's going to be the theme of the morning, right? Is this idea of species. Why should we care about species? I mean, Michael Soule tells us we should, but why should we actually care about them? And the reason that it's confusing is because I teach evolutionary biology, and one of the first things I teach them is that species don't really exist, right? So this is the classic quote from Darwin. That I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given. That's 1859. But if you move up to 2023, this is, I think, a very, very clear, recent, long essay on what species are and how you might delineate them by Wayne Madison and Jeanette Whitten, where they talk about species as being reproductive communities, but they say, this is from the abstract, so this is not buried in the discussion, which communities naturally deserve to be ranked as species and which are simply demes or populations is a vexing and likely futile question. So even in 2023, with all our genomic data and 175 years of thinking about this, we don't believe that species exist really, or at least they only exist in a certain way. And the problem is just geography. So if you go to a woodland in Czechia or to a mountain in Western Canada, you can count all the species that are in that place. right? And there are good ecological reasons why most of the time, 99% of the time, you'd be correct. Everybody would agree on the number of species in that place. But if you started to walk away from where you are, this is supposed to represent space. So this is where we were, and these three species were here. But as you walk away, you really don't know when you stop seeing the same species and started to see a different species. And that's just because of natural selection and drift, and mostly natural selection, right? So delineating different things on the landscape is much, much harder. And the reason for that, I think, and this is not, I don't know if it's completely testable, but there have been some tests that are completely consistent with this, is that the average duration that something that we'd all agree is a species exists on the Earth, that duration is on the same order of magnitude as the time it takes to make a new species. They're both on the 1 to 10 million year timescale. So we know of speciation events that can be instantaneous with polyploidy. We know of speciation events that can happen very, very quickly, post-glaciation in certain situations. We know those, we study those, we like those. But most speciation takes time, takes multiple glacial cycles, for instance, if you're here in the Northern Hemisphere. And most species only last for 2 to 3 million years. We have some of the old ones, and I'll show you some that we have very, very old ones, but on average. So the speciation time and the species duration time are on the same order of magnitude. So of course you're not going to be able to know often when, how many species. This is just, I won't belabor this. I'll throw this in here so if people want to look at the slides later, they can see it. This is just even if you look at mitochondrial sequence divergence for sister species pairs or just pairs of populations within species, you find that they overlap quite a bit. That's why you need to take away this graph, old data. Just as an example, here's orangutans. So orangutans currently only live on 2 islands here in Indonesia, Borneo and Sumatra. These are the females from Borneo, females from Sumatra. These are the males from Borneo, males from Sumatra. They look all pretty much like orangutans to most of us. And they were named by Linnaeus as Homo troglodites, as a matter of fact. So one of the first species he actually named. They were brought back. They've been in captivity since the early 1700s. Happily breed in captivity. Happily, they don't care. Named as one species in 1827, with 2 subspecies, one from each island. In 1996, there was just a suggestion that they should each should become its own species. This was contested, and I just put this quote in here because it's going to come back, I think, keep it back in mind. It is essential that conservation issues, so what Soulé was talking about, be removed from the vagaries of academic systematics arguments, i.e., on the one hand, we believe that species are special, but on the other hand, we shouldn't worry about what we call them, whether we have them or not, which is a little bit confused. So they were raised to be 2 species, and the environmental non-government organizations recognized them as 2 species in the early 2000s. And then in 2017, this tiny little population here from Papua Nuli, genomic work suggested that it should be a 3rd species, and it was instantly recognized as a 3rd species. So the paper was published in 2017, and by 2018, 2019, the IUCN Red List listed it as a 3rd species. So they're now 3. So when I started my career, there was 1 species of orangutan, and now, at sort of the tail end of my career, there are 3 species of orangutan. Nothing's changed on the ground except our knowledge. And this is not just orangutan. So this is 1982 up to 2016. This is the number of species of just primates, and it's more than doubled, right? So we have our biodiversity has increased dramatically from 1982 to 2016 in all different families here. So just the percent changes, the number of species changed, and you can see there's been huge increases in the number of species. So it's not a static, stable thing. Primates are maybe a little bit extreme here as an example, but this is not uncommon. Okay, so how do we do Soulé-style species conservation if we don't really know what we're talking about? So that's what we're going to discuss, or I'm going to discuss. We'll discuss today. And there's the agenda, there are three parts of the agenda. First, we talk about sort of a case study about how one country deals with the species problem and conserving species. And it's one country in Canada. Because I was very surprised when I started to help out doing the conservation assessment of species in Canada, what the law actually was telling us that we should do. We're then going to talk about valuing species based on Soulet's long evolutionary heritage. And this is just a metric. So this is talking. These are just some metrics. So I mean, if there are any economists, they might be interested in this part. I don't know if geographers or philosophers will care about this particular part, but it's connected to this part. And then I want to actually, if we have time, we'll talk about what the locus of value might actually be that connects these two. And yeah, offer some thoughts about what we might actually be doing versus what we say we're doing. Okay, does that make sense as an agenda? Yeah. Any questions at this point? The English is okay?
Yeah,
Canadian is okay? Slower?
yeah, it's fine. I don't know. Sometimes like my guess is like from the completely uninformed perspective, I would guess what we value is something like how much cognitive evolution spent in like creating the species.
How much time?
Time, not time, but like kind of you can look on evolution as a computational process, like kind of changing bits.
Yeah,
and like,
yeah.
And my guess is the value which we actually care about is like how much evolution, like how much compute evolution spent.
Okay, that's
So it's not time.
okay, but it is. But time is the metric we're using. But yes, we'll get to this.
Yeah.
We'll get to this exactly this question. Yes, and in fact, there's a quote. Yes, great. We'll keep that thought because we will come back to it. But first, so I started here, and then I moved to here in my intellectual growth. But I'm going to start here to move from small to large. Okay. So, as you all, well, as most of you probably know, there's many sort of flavors of the species. There's the biological species concept, whether you breed. There's something called the phylogenetic species concept, which is whether you're just mostly related to each other, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the different ways that you can, what sort of different types of data that you can use to decide whether something's a species or not. But there are influential philosophers who actually suggest that most of the ways that we think of a species are biospecies, but you could have ecospecies. So these are phylospecies, but you can have ecospecies, for instance. So you could just only talk about interchangeability. So if you can move an individual to another place and nobody would notice, and it must be the same species. If the ecosystem doesn't react, you could call it the same species, for instance. So there's different ways of thinking about what a species is. And according to Stein Koenigs, that means that taxonomists who have to decide, have to name them, and this becomes important, are actually making unforced ontological choices. They're actually making choices that matter, but not being explicit about it. Because, and this is the point, is that different definitions can have different conservation outcomes. So depending on what you think a species is and how you define it may affect what actually happens on the ground. So they're value choices. And Koenig suggested that maybe taxonomists should learn some philosophy and be able to be explicit about the kinds of values that they bring in to their work. And sometimes people do. So if we go back to these orangutans, for instance, Frank in 2012, so long before this third orangutan was discovered, suggested that the biological species concept, which is interbreeding, so if things can interbreed, it's a single species, and if things don't interbreed, they're different species. That's the biological species. In a nutshell, that's the biological species concept, is the one you should use for conservation. So given you've got multiple options of definitions, if you're interested in conservation, you should use the biological species concept. Because that allows for gene flow. Anything that can interbreed, you're like, good, they're the same species, let them do their thing. That maximizes genetic variation, therefore the template upon which natural selection can act. So we would say that's a good thing as an evolutionary biologist. So, using that argument, this little tiny little population, there are fewer than 800 of these individuals in the world. This is a very, it's not even an isolated population, but it's a very small population. And the rest of the few individuals that there are in Sumatra should be considered a single species because these two can breed. And males do walk from here to here. Definitely. There's good genetic evidence for that. So there is gene flow, at least in this direction, and there's gene flow in the other direction as well. So you would have two species. Other authors suggest that no. If you actually build the tree using genomic data, you get this sort of pattern. So this is a pattern. This is the past. There's no time on this axis, but this is just a graph showing this is the past, and that these two populations are more closely related than either is to this group, where they have this shared branch. Right? So that's how you define the genetic tree. And Tapanuli, that's what made everyone confused, is the Tapanuli population tended to share many genes with the Bornean population, the other island. So this is the actual underlying phylogeny. And if you believe that species are phylogenetic clusters, then there should be three. Even though these two breed, there should be three species, separate populations. Very large, very, varied. Those two views would give you different ideas about how you should conserve that very small population, right? And specifically, whether you should let any genes from here flow into here. So you can imagine the situation, and this is what happens in Canada, where if this is considered to be a species, then you would stop males from this population to get into this population, right? Because that would be gene flow that you don't want to have. So pretty dramatic management.
Are you wondering?
Yes.
What's the time distance between these two directions?
This is on the order of hundreds of thousands of years. Here, and 10 to the 6 here. This is with the genomic data, so there's lots of gene flow. So these are not. You have to remember that Indonesia was all connected during the interglacials. Of course, those islands were connected and connected to the mainland. So there's been a series of isolations and then connections between those two islands and the mainland. In Arangton used to be on the mainland as well. So yeah, so it's that order. It's exactly at that 1 to 10 million year timescale that we're talking about, where it's hard to differentiate. So that's a good example of that. Thank you. So, but that means that it matters, right? And yet another philosopher suggests that which discusses this concept of conceptual engineering, where you actually change the meaning of something to serve a purpose. So say, well, wait a minute, we should make species. If we care about, if we're doing Soule style conservation, we should actually use the species. We should engineer the species concept that's fit for purpose. So it's no longer sort of a objective, your species concept is as good as my species concept. It's actually, you have to make an ethical choice, which is kind of odd. At least for evolutionary biologists who never think about things like that. Well, why does this, what is this all a backdrop for? Well, it's all a backdrop for the fact that there are laws for protecting species, right? We have Endangered Species Protection Act, we have Endangered Species Act, we have a Species at Risk Act, and they all talk about protecting species. And these laws actually define species for us, and they have nothing to do with Ereshefsky's or Myers or Frankham's or anybody's species concepts. So this is the Species at Risk Act in Canada from 2002. And it's called the Species at Risk Act, but what's actually being protected is something called a wildlife species. So they put a name in front of it called a wildlife species so that they could define it themselves. And they did. And it is a species, subspecies, variety, which is a plant term, or geographically, or genetically distinct population. So that gives you a lot of latitude to decide what a species is. So one sort of first question you ask yourself is that, does wildlife species have anything to do with what Soule said had value? Right? Remember, he was saying species have value, intrinsic value in and of themselves, blah, 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 blah. And yet the law tells us that they want to protect, or they want to consider in their Species at Risk Act, something as small as a population. Okay, so I sit on the committee that decides on which species we assess, et cetera, et cetera. It's called COSWIC. And we have to operationalize that. the first thing that we noticed fairly recently, actually, is that that definition actually probably comes from 1973, and it probably comes from the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, because the terminology is almost exactly the same: species, subspecies, or geographically separate population thereof. So in 1973, they didn't talk about genetics. They talked about geographically separate populations as being species. So that's how species are defined in the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, right? So CITES has species in the title, but it's actually about these things. And about 11 countries that we could find actually use that definition as their legal definition of species. Okay, as a parenthesis, yes.
When you were talking about that, they possibly like copy pasted the
Copy
definition
pasted, yeah.
of species definition from CITES.
Yes.
Do you know anyone who's been like taking part in construction of this 2002 law? Because there must have been some like biologists involved, right? There must have been some like other than political discussion about how to defend, wasn't there?
So I was part of the scientist group that lobbied for that law and sent in briefs on. There was just a group, there was basically one group of scientists. At that time, I had no idea that they had cut and paste from that. This was being cut and paste from paste, and nobody talked about this. It just wasn't on the radar. So I don't know who wrote, which lawyer did that. I just don't know. Yeah, it's one of the things I like to know, because I'd like to know who was in the room that decided that this was the right way to do it. I have no idea. Yeah, exactly. As I say, this connection is fairly recent, because actually when we just got into it, I'm like, well, where did this come from anyway? Yeah, discuss this. The parenthesis, and why this is weird, is that if there is some literature on how CITES came up with that definition, and they actually were quite, on commentary about the history, that geographically separate population is a political boundary population. They wanted to know whether the wolves came from New Mexico or from Mexico, because it mattered to CITES, and therefore they wanted to be able to call those different populations because of the different political structures that were associated with shooting wolves in those two places. And so that's why they came up with geographically separate population. No biology whatsoever. So I don't want to accuse anybody of cutting and pasting, but I don't know what's going on. We really didn't know what's going on. So COSWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, so that's what the acronym is. Okay, it doesn't matter. I'll say COSWIC. That's just the group of science. It's a scientific advisory board that has to both delineate wildlife species and then decide if they're at risk or not. So it has two jobs. We have to decide what is a wildlife species. And they've been doing it for a while. It's been around before the law came along. But when the law came along, they said, okay, we have to figure out how we're going to do this, how we're going to operationalize this. And came up with this thing called a designatable unit. So it's a new term. Just a term supposed to capture what all this stuff could be. And what it states is that a group of populations, an area that contains individuals of a plant or whatever, could be a legal wildlife species if it's discrete and evolutionarily significant relative to other populations. And it turns out that we've assessed about 1,000 of Canada wildlife species, and about a third of them are these infraspecific units, something smaller than what Soule is probably talking about. That's a lot, right? 30% is a lot. But smaller than a species. Okay, so here's my first sort of thesis statement. The way that we have operationalized this definition of something has to be discrete and significant. Discrete is fairly straightforward. I mean, I can talk a lot about how we decide whether something is different, right? But how do you decide whether something's significant, evolutionarily significant? It turns out that some of the people in the room, so we're in a room like this, bigger than this, but we're sitting around a table and we're discussing, okay, is this a species or is this not a species, which is a really important decision to make from a conservation perspective. Half the people believe that it's a subspecific or a designatable unit or an intraspecific unit, whatever you want to call it. This smallest unit is a component of something real. It's a component of this other thing called the species, right? So it's a component definition. Or think of it as the appendage to the body. The other half of the people, other half of the group, this may be a smaller minority, think of the wildlife species as being a baby species. So it's a nascent. Remember, because we're talking about it takes time for speciation to occur, there's going to be a lot of populations out there that have a chance of becoming good species. They just haven't, no one's named them yet. They're not quite different enough yet. Whatever the criteria you use, they just haven't been met. And so you actually have these two competing views of what these wildlife species might be. So is it a component or is it the fundamental unit? And again, if you're talking about cutting and pasting, if you go back to what Kosovic was using, we actually drew language from what the Americans did. They had something called discrete population segments, which later became evolutionary significant units. Sorry, there's lots of terms here. Point being that you can trace back these ideas as to how you do the definitions, and what the language was for how Canada was doing it is really based on ESUs, evolutionary significant units, which are contributing part definitions. This came about because, like orangutans, there were lots of tigers in zoos, and the tigers came from different places. There were Amur tigers, and there were Indian tigers, and there were Asiatic tigers, and they didn't know what to do with all these different types of tigers. They're all tigers. They could all breed happily in zoos, and they tried to figure out how they could make sure that they wouldn't lose the components, the genes that those tigers embodied, coming from different parts of the world. And so they said that you have to define this thing called an evolutionary significant unit, which is a population that possesses genetic attributes that are significant for present and future generations of the species. So it's a component, right? They don't think of them as baby species. They're thinking of them as genes that you have to retain because they're important for the larger whole. Now, the reason I belabor this is that we don't think of species as being parts of a genus, right? We don't think of as a species as being an intimate component of a genus. A genus is just a taxonomic rank that we use to sort of organize things, but you don't think of it as a real thing. Whereas here, we're thinking of the species as a real thing, and these are component parts. That's what I'm saying. It's like an appendage of an actual body. So that's a component part, a contributing part, or component part definition. There are other reasons if you just look at how these DUs are being defined. For instance, if you lose a population, it would make the rest of the population more discrete. Then you would consider this to be important, and therefore it would be an important component, and so therefore you would consider it to be a DU, which is also contributing part definition. But the reason that I said that there was confusion is that on the one hand, we're saying, yeah, these are important component parts, but on the other hand, as soon as you defined it as a species, as a wildlife species, you couldn't have gene flow from anywhere else. The gene flow from another part became a threat, just in the same way that they wanted to keep the tigers separate. They wanted to keep, because they wanted to preserve them, but with some goal in mind about tigerness. Here, there's a gene flow from elsewhere is now considered an explicit threat to this new wildlife species. So that's more thinking about it as a fundamental unit. You want to keep it as keepable, right? You want to conserve it as is. And that's really problematic, especially for endangered species where they are small population sizes and they can go extinct if you don't do something about it, right? There are lots of genetic problems. So here's a good example. So this is just a YouTube video of this little guy here. This is a helmeted honey eater. This is in South Australia. Southeast Australia, bunch of different subs. They're named as different subspecies. There's this one, which is the helmeted one, that is highly endangered, and it's so highly endangered that it's critically endangered. This one here, this one here, this Cassidex, that they decided to actively breed it with other subspecies to build up the genetic variation so that it can continue. Something can continue. It's going to have genes from somewhere else, but it's going to still be called the helmeted honey eater. This one, it's got a little helmet on it. And therefore, they might be able to conserve that unit of biodiversity. We couldn't do that in Canada, right? Because as soon as you name it, you can't let genes come in from elsewhere. Does that make sense? So that's the tension. All right. And there's the Australians again. So this is other work, older work. But again, this is the idea that one should not try to separate populations out, name them and conserve them as is. because those populations are likely going to be too small for long-term evolution, and so it's better to mix them all together, which is more like the biological species concept, right? So Frankum's idea of keep them as a single species so that you can do that kind of genetic intervention is the right way for conservation. Whereas in Canada, at least, and in America, the same thing, there's a tendency to split and therefore make these populations really small. And then, of course, you have to spend even more money trying to conserve them because there's so few of them. We know that gene flow can be helpful, but this is just an example from science of a particular killifish, where they found that there was a particular species that was doing very well in very polluted water in the Gulf of Mexico, surprisingly so. And then they looked to see what were the adaptations that allowed it to live in this polluted water, and they found that the genes of large effect were genes that had come from another species, entirely different species. They had hybridized, and then those genes had turned out to be useful in this new context. The different species actually was from the Atlantic and actually had been introduced into the Gulf of Mexico. So sort of a double whammy. So the humans had moved it in, different species, by mistake. They had crossbred, but that crossbreeding had led to an adaptation that allowed the species that was in the endemic species there to do well in a new environment. So we know that gene flow from other species can actually be helpful. So everyone know what this is? What type of bear is it? Nothing? You don't know? That's a cross between a polar bear and a grizzly bear. So the Osnabrück Zoo actually has them. They do just fine. But you can, if you know your bears, you can sort of tell that this is that part here is very much polar bearish, and of course the coloring is very much grizzly bearish. They're now found in the wild because of climate change. Because of climate change, the polar bears are coming off the ice onto land more, and the grizzly bears are exploding in the north, at least in Canada. Exploding. I mean, they're expanding their populations, and so now they're coming together. We're ecologically different. Like orangutans in the zoo, they're happy to breed, and in the wild, they also breed. We don't know how common it is, but we find them on the land. And here's a Guardian article from a few years ago, actually about polar bears. I'm using them as an example, and where they quote, some scientists argue that we should encourage hybridization into endangered species. Completely opposite of this idea that one subspecies or one designated unit is a threat to another. We should actively, not even within a species, but we should just actively encourage gene flow because that's the only thing that's going to save these small populations in the face of a rapidly changing climate. Yes.
So I see some ethical
Yes.
conflict in this.
Yes.
I also misunderstood or cannot understand how should we encourage or protect these two species that have large areas. We cannot prevent the individuals crossing the ocean because conditions change. So is there any activity that we can do to either encourage or protect these two species to become separate units? Or is it just theoretical?
Yeah, I think it's still in the realm of theory. You can definitely conceive of you can shoot the hybrids. You can sterilize the hybrids. Yeah. No. I know it sounds crazy, but it is in the same way that we shoot wolves to protect particular caribou populations, right? Because we built the roads that allow the wolves to come in, and now we're like, oh my gosh, there are too many wolves, and we actually shoot them from helicopters, like costing like $20,000 a wolf or whatever. If you think about how much it costs to shoot a wolf from a helicopter, it's not inconceivable that we could sterilize or shoot hybrid. These guys, they're easy to see. You can shoot them, right? But no one has suggested that yet. Now, how you would encourage it? I don't know how you would encourage it, but you could certainly encourage it in zoos, for instance. All right. And this, I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but this is the funny thing about orangutans. Because there are a lot of orangutans in zoos around the world. It's probably some in Leipzig. I don't know. It's probably many, probably 100 in Europe. So they're all mixed because in the 1700s, 1800s, people didn't care. They're not allowed to move. They're not allowed to use those for conservation. They're stuck in zoos. They will never. None of those genes will ever get out. 100 years from now, all orangutans may be in zoos. Right? That's perfectly conceivable with the way things are going. that there will be no wild orangutans left. So there's now a movement. Well, not a movement. Sorry, no. There's now a discussion about how they could produce zoos with just pure orangutans from those 3 species. At least 2. The third one they can't even get in there. But they'll never be able to use those orangutans from those zoos. All those zoo orangutans. A lot of good genes in there. And if you believe that hybridization is not necessarily a bad thing and even can be a good thing, why not let natural selection do its thing? Throw them out in the wild. The ones that do well, do well. The ones that don't do well, won't do well. But that's the way it works, and you'd end up with something, right? So there is some encouragement that's possible. 100 years down, I mean, we're talking maybe 50, 100 years, but it could be within the young people's lifetime here that we'll have no more orangutans in the wild. Those oil plantations are going in like fast, really fast. Yeah.
Also, I think that like this like eradication of like new species that we do not consider species or do not want to exist is not like such an absurd strategy in some cases. For example, in invasion biology, like you can easily consider the invaders a new species as like, you know, they are getting frequently eradicated.
Oh yeah, well we read.
So it's like protecting, yeah, especially plants. So like protecting nature by actually trying to make a new species. Actually, if it's a new species of like, you know, not wheat that was like transplanted to Europe from Eastern Asia, is like it's not an like absurd practice. It's something that is really happening.
A lot. Oh yeah, there's lots of control. Lots of control.
Of course, if it's big and fluffy, it's a little bit more problematic for the public, but yeah.
True. True. Yes, so that's sort of that. But that's kind of, I think you're right, most, it's still sort of, we're in the discussion stage.
Yeah. And I would expect on like timescales like 50 years or like even sooner, it should be considerable to like take the DNA of the orangutans in zoos, like kind of like sample the DNAs of the wild population, kind of like simulate like how, like kind of like create some sort of like artificial, like kind of like how do you can plausibly like edit the DNA of.
Well, it's like the variable, it's like the resurrection.
But less absurd than the resurrection.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure. But using the same techniques, for instance. Yeah. But whether it's worth it is another question, because that's still expensive. Okay, so all that to say that there's a big discussion, and now at least you see that there's an issue there about what these units might be. We decided that we were going to go with the fundamental unit route. So we were actually going to say we were only going to, so which means you have to think hard about what is a unit that is viable. But if it's a viable unit that you think is a good chance of being an independently evolving lineage, we're going to call that a wildlife species. And not all these little component parts. Because when we were looking at component parts, I don't have the slide here, but the crisis actually came about because somebody tabled a report that said there are 100 different wildlife species of one particular very small fish in Canada. And we all said, well, we can't protect 100 different species of this little whitefish. I mean, we could, but we don't think society is going to agree that we should spend that much money on every lake having its own little endangered whitefish. So we're like, okay, well, if we take a different perspective and say, well, these are not component parts, well, which, these are all very recent species, blah, 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 that probably don't need to protect them all. So we're going to go the fundamental unit route. We voted on it, we agreed on it, but the debate continues as of November 2025. So it's still not clear whether people are still uncomfortable. There's still two camps of conservation biologists in the room. Those that believe in the component part and those that believe in the ability lineage. Conceptualization, using that whatever we call ethical engineering about what we should do. So it ceases to become a biological problem now. It's just a problem of values. Oops. So the good thing about considering a wildlife species as a fundamental unit is that with all a species or a wildlife, like they would call them all wildlife species and we treat them exactly the same way. They're all just these evolutionary units that we could then protect, right? So they would all be fundamental units of biodiversity. There wouldn't be any difference, just whether they have a name or not. And these interspecific units would just be the ones with a bet that they're going to be a new evolutionary lineage is just a worse bet because they haven't gone long enough. They're not old enough that we can be sure. We're just sort of making a guess. It's the same thing. Even good species can collapse. So It's not really a problem. Okay, so that's part one. And I'll see how it's connected to part two in just a minute. So just the conclusions in the first part. There are ethical dimensions associated with designating something a species, which is a fairly new idea for a lot of people in evolutionary biology. Legal species are not close to biological species, which is a big surprise to a lot of conservation biologists who thought they knew what they were talking about when they were talking about protecting species. Legal species may conflate sociopolitics with biology. That's just this idea that we're cutting and pasting definitions. Don't quote me on that. That's not published. That's just, I'm still working on that, but because it is just an inference based on language. And legal species, not only in Canada, but also in the United States and elsewhere, these smaller units may be mixing different ideas about component versus lineage views of the bit of biodiversity that needs attention. So I'll call these things bits of biodiversity, the smallest unit. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I know that my question isn't very biological now, but I'm thinking there is also culture in these animals, and which makes sometimes problem when introducing them into wild.
100%,
these
yes.
definitions, they are purely physically biological. Do someone
Yes.
Involve the cultural
Yes,
differences
yes,
and this
yes,
programming?
yes. I think the answer is a definitive yes. In Canada, we talk about when we're trying to delineate these things, that they have to have heritable differences. The culture is inherited, and culture is explicitly incorporated as one of the types of traits that can be used to differentiate populations as being distinct and significant. So a lot of our beluga whale, we have one species of beluga whale, beautiful, I don't have a picture, but you know what a beluga whale is? Little whale, cute little whale, white. As an adult, it's white. It's pink as a baby and white as an adult. We have a single species, it's the same name, so it's all got the same name, but we have 7 different wildlife species because the moms, they learn from their mother where to go to feed in the summer, and their matrilineal lines, they always go to the same place and they come back. They breed separately, so the males move around, so they're genetically pretty much indistinguishable. The mitochondria show the matrilines, but the genomic, the nuclear data, which is mom and dad, do not. But because they are inheriting their culture of their parents, they're considered to be separate lineages.
How strong is better because in North Canada there are many islands. I know that those birds can swim easily.
Yes,
but still, how strong are these streams?
over bears, yeah. That's a really good question. So when we assessed polar bear, when we looked at polar bears last, we considered them to be a single wildlife species, but there were people who suggested that there were multiple cultural lineages of polar bears. Now, polar bears, they don't just swim a little bit, they can go thousands of, like they're crazy in terms of how far they can range. So they're not territorial at all. But the Inuit people up there do talk about different types of bears, the inland, the ones near the coast and the ones that are inland, and they believe that they're actually are separate culturally, eat slightly different things, you know, they're in slightly different environments. And that knowledge, so genetically, I mean, as you say, it's a huge area. So there's some genetic structure, but it's weak because of all this movement. But those observations of there being 2 types of bears has not been incorporated into here yet. Mostly because it's not Western science and it's very difficult. We're still figuring out how to evaluate or incorporate that. So it could very well be that in 10 years time, in 7 years time, when we look at polar bears next, we may designate more than one wildlife species. And that will be very interesting to see what happens, because some biologists will be very upset because they're like, where's the biology, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a whole different, I mean, that's a whole different layer of sort of value discussion. Right? But whose culture are you, what type of data are you looking at? Yeah, polar bears is probably a great example. Okay, any questions about this? Yeah.
One thing connected to the birds and to the whales.
Yeah.
What if we protect or underlaw the umbrella species, the high strength that connects all the population social, then all them are automatically protected. And there is no necessary to discuss how many populations actually.
So the problem, let's pretend it's Canada, US. It's gonna depend. The problem is that we have many species whose ranges, well, there's the Rockies here, whose ranges look like this. So they're doing just fine in the States. This is the umbrella. This is the umbrella species. And then we have little pockets up here in Canada. These guys might be doing very well. This population is not doing well. If you assess it as a single species in Canada, you would be, it's doing okay, which means it might not get any money, no protection. Then you lose this population, right? So all the people here are like, we've now, why did you guys do that? And we're like, oh, it's because they're doing just fine here. No, it doesn't work. I'm trying to do it. Giving them a different name, now they're a different wildlife species, right? Now they're a different thing. Now you can protect this one too. So, but this gets to the crux of the problem. As a country, should we care about these guys if these guys are okay? Well, not if it's the same species, but should we care about these guys if these guys are okay? Yes, if they're a different species. And that's the ethical problem. That's like my last slide. Get back to that for my last slide.
Yeah, just this like very general principle in like almost any domain, like sometimes called like Goodhart's law, that like you have a metric.
Yeah.
In this case, you have an ontology, and
Yeah,
it kind of works if it's like descriptive.
Yes.
But once you start like optimize, like if you start like using it as an optimization target, like it ceases to be such a great metric, because then it like I don't know, like motivates people to.
Yes, it motivates people to
like kind of like motivates people to do something with the ontology if they have some preferences for the outcome. And this is like, yeah, fairly like it's like universal in almost like any domain. Like you can find examples of this principle that like use something descriptive, so people are using it just to like I don't know, cluster something or something. Yep. But like once you start optimizing, like you will.
Well, that's exactly.
The metric like stops like being like such a metric.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I need those references because
I
think that's exactly what's happening. Exactly. It's gone from descriptive to optimization. Exactly. Okay, great. So now we're going to move into part 2. And part 2 is that even if you made all these things equal footing under the law, right, they're all fundamental units, then are some of them more important than others? But maybe people don't think that a single subspecies is as important as a good species, right? Because it's very closely related to something else. It looks very much like something else. We've already got that. Why do we need this other one? Or maybe, I mean, we may need it, but maybe it's not as important. And then perhaps a species that is the only member of this genus might be, or family, might be even more important, right? So now you can think of elapsed, well, as you're saying, information, or we're going to use time as the metric, as a way to do triage, to rank these species by their relative value. Now, why would we do that? We do that because we only have so much money, and we only have so much time, and we can't protect everything. So which ones do we look at, or do we make sure we don't lose? Like which are our top priority bits of biodiversity? So here is the polar bear again, and you would say, well, okay, if you've got $1 million, do you give it to the polar bear, or do you give it to the panda? How many people want to give it to the polar bear? And people would rather give it to the panda. And then it says panda, it says panda, panda. Anyone for polar bear? Tall? So it's about half a million. So from the point of view of this, you could make an argument. There are 3 different species in that genus. We already know that this one is very closely related to the grizzly bear. They can interbreed and have babies, and those babies are just fine. So I should say those babies are fine and have babies themselves. Whereas this is the only member of its subfamily. There's nothing like it. It goes back 30 million years probably, before it connects into the rest of the tree. So if you're disinterested and you don't live in China or in the north, you might say this one is somehow more valuable than this one, because most of these genes are found in the grizzly bear. Most of these genes, I mean, the differences are found nowhere else, right? There's a lot of unique information here in this genome on Earth. Okay, so that takes us to part 2. People want to stretch?
Yeah.
Everyone's okay? 20 seconds?
Well, pandas, like.
Yeah.
Comes to what the value is, because.
Yes.
The amount of money which flows to protect the panda, it's like.
Lots.
Extreme,
Yes.
and the panda is anyway on its way to extinction. It's just basically being like kept here just because of large amount of money which flows there.
Mhm.
So.
I know, it's
in terms of money.
Yes.
It's making much more than the very good.
I agree, absolutely. It's an unfair comparison because pandas politically are extremely, yeah, I know, no, but it means everyone knows it, so that's why I use it, because everyone agrees, but agree, it brings up all these other things. But these are also other considerations when you're making it. In one sense, forcing people to do that comparison forces them to think about the fact that this is definitely not the only axis that they would use in order to make some sort of decision about conservation activity. But you do have to ask yourself why people got interested in pandas in the first place. Like, why did the Chinese decide that the pandas, why did the world decide that pandas were the symbol of conservation biology? Well, they are very different. They're the only bears that eat bamboo, right? They are very different from everything else. So there is something about them being different and that may be correlated with the fact that they have close relatives.
Are there any strong reasons to prefer polar bear over the panda and to polar panda over the, or are these reasons symmetric, completely symmetric?
We'd have to talk about what you mean by a reason. People have different values, and based on their values, they will prefer one over the other. If you give somebody an axis of value, so to say it's not yours, I'm going to give you this axis of value, then you might be able to make to differentiate between the two of them, but it would depend on the axis of value that you give.
I suppose that any value
Biologically.
should be supported by some reason.
Yeah, but the reasoning would be based on certain criteria. So you have to give the criteria first. Otherwise, people would have their own values. So as an evolution, well, let's go through the metrics, and then you can see whether any of them make sense. So I could give you what I think, but let's just wait and go through the metrics. So should we prioritize the conservation of some species over others? Well, we already do. This is just from the Canadian National newspaper from a decade ago that just points out that while traditionalists warn against betraying conservation's key tenets, that's Soulei's key tenet that all species have intrinsic value, right? From polar bears to pygmy pocket moss, they share the same right to exist. That was what Soulei said. Others say conservation efforts have been valuing certain species over others, polar bears, in a hodgepodge, so random, chaotic, whatever, for decades, right? So that's the claim. And most conservation biologists would agree that you can say all these great things, but all species are sacred, but we put some money in some and less money in others, and we completely ignore a third group. Interestingly, the IPBES, which is like the IPCCC, but it's for biodiversity, so the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so UN-sponsored umbrella organization that does reports and sets goals on how we should conserve biodiversity. This is just sort of the position paper from 2020, and they say that one of the things that humanity should do is to safeguard the tree of life. So I've already showed you what a tree is, and they're suggesting that we should safeguard the tree of life, which means we should try to conserve as much of evolution as we can, because that's what that tree represents, as evolution. And if you look in the appendix of that, you'll find that evolutionarily distinct species should be prioritized. It's high level of ambition, but it's one of the main things that they suggest that humanity should do. We should prioritize particular species, and they should be the ones that are evolutionarily distinct. Okay, so part 2, this is the longer part of the talk, the third part's very, very short, so don't worry. we're going to try to unpack this IPPE goal in the context of prioritizing species, where we're moving now from populations to species to variation among species. So what do we mean by evolutionary distinct? How is it connected to the safeguarding the tree of life? So how are these two connected? And then, importantly, which kind of gets to your point, what does this tree of life? What are we actually trying to capture? These things are just metrics of something else. And the question is, what is that something else? Does that make sense? That's where we're going to go. Yeah. Okay. Okay. What is evolutionary distinctness? How many people? Oh, Anthony's probably heard it. Jan's heard it. Who else has ever heard that term? Is that term in general? Is people know it? Most people know it. Okay, so I can go through this pretty fast then. Stop me if it's too fast. Okay. It's a general term. I'll call it evolutionary isolation, which all it does is describe. So think of these four things as four different species. So you're four different species of bear or something. You build a phylogenetic tree. These two are more closely related. This group is related to this group, and this group is related to this group. And that's what the tree is telling you. It splits here, it splits here, it splits here. And then you ask which one is the most distinct. And the most distinct species is the one that has the fewest close relatives. So D here is the most distinct because it has more of the tree that is unique to it. You think of it that way. So ticks with few close relatives are more distinct. Fewer relatives, more distinct. So here D is the more distinct than A. A is not distinct because it shares a lot of evolution with B. Make sense? Excellent. So there's your panda, and there's your polar bear, and there's your grizzly bear, for instance. Grad student of mine, who's now at the Zoological Society of London, he came up with a particular measure of this isolation, which is called fair proportion, so FD. You're going to see that. And I apologize for all the acronyms, but that's the measure. And all it does is it cuts the tree up into little bits. So species A, which we're going to calculate its fair proportion index, it gets all of its own evolution. It gets half of the evolution that it shares with B, and it gets 1/3 of the evolution that it shares with B and C. So 1/3 goes to C, 1/3 goes to B, and 1/3 goes to A. Half goes to B and half goes to A. So it's just the sum of each branch length divided by all the other species that share that branch length. So you cut the tree up into lots of little pieces. Every edge you cut up in as many pieces as it has descendants, and then you just pass out all those pieces. And then the one that gets the most pieces is the one that's most distinct, right? Because D gets all three of this because it shares it with nobody else, right? So we get 3. Whereas this one will just get 1.1.5, 1.166, whatever. 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/3. 1.83, right? So that would be the fair proportion. So you can do that on any tree, whether you have branch lengths. Generally, those branch lengths are in units of time, millions of years. So we consider time to be a measure of amount of evolution that has occurred. And great discussions about whether they're better measures than based using the entire genome, but this is what people use because it's fungible across groups, et cetera, and that gives you this fair proportion index. So FP is weighted towards local tree shape because you always get your own branch. So it's correlated with species age. So remember we talked about how old species are? That is the biggest component of the FP. And it's got some other properties that are used. So here's just an old tree that this is one of the first trees for which we were able to do this. This is all the birds of the world, so 10,000 species of birds. This is a tree. There's the root here, so it's turned into a circle just so you can make it fit. And then it splits here and splits here into 2 groups, and splits here into 2 groups. It splits and splits and splits and splits and splits, and then all the species are here on the outside. That's just a depiction. And then you can ask, well, which species owns most of the tree? Like, what's the most isolated species on the tree? And it turns out that it's the hoatzin of South America. So it's tied for number 1. It's the pretty crazy looking bird. But the cool thing about the hoatzin is that it's the only bird that's a ruminant. So it's the only bird that eats food like a cow. Chews a bunch of leaves, then it sits there, and then it actually digests them with bacteria, makes a lot of methane, and that's how it runs. It's the only bird that does that. Right? It's like an ungulate. So it's quite special about it. The other cool thing about it, and now I'm on the other computer, so I can't show you the little video, which is terrible because it's very cute. As a baby, it actually has hands. So it's the baby wings actually have an extra appendage that's just like a hand. And the reason is that because it lives above water in sort of in swamps, and the babies fall out of the nests a lot, and then they're able to climb back up with their little hands. And so this is a little video of it following me home and climbing back up. It's very cute. It's not an actual hand, and it loses that appendage later. Anyway, a couple of cool things about the #1 most isolated species. And and this is the program that actually sort of motivates this. This is called the Edge of Existence program that's run out of the Zoological Society of London, where they take these numbers, rank the species by how isolated they are, right, by this FP, and then they ask, well, which ones are also at risk of extinction? And they're the ones that we actually put money in to conserve, right? So they're ranking the species using evolutionary isolation as their metric. And we've done it for mammals, we've done it for birds, we've done it for sharks, we've done it for corals, we've done it for lots of different. Okay, so that's evolutionarily distinct. How is it related to safeguarding the tree of life? To do that, I could reduce you to another metric, not FP, but called ED, which is phylogenetic diversity. Same thing. It uses a tree. It uses the branches of the tree. It generally assumes that those branches are measured in terms of the amount of evolution, which is in terms of millions of years. And all it does, it says, we just add up all the branches that connects a group of species. So we say, what's the phylogenetic diversity of the group A, C, E? So for instance, if B and D went extinct, then we would just look at the tree that connects those. And we would say it's 5 + 1 + 1 + 3 + 2 + 2. And that would be the phylogenetic diversity of that subgroup. So instead of being a measure of a single species, it's a measure of a subgroup. And that would be the tree that it represents, the tree that that set of species actually represents. So it's just the sum of the branch lengths of the subtree defined by that subset. Yeah.
Wondering, the extinction of terminal points of
Yes.
this tree has special pattern. This classification follows grossly different pattern than the extinction of terminal points. So isn't it sort of domestication of artificial selection?
So this metric doesn't actually have anything to do with extinction at this point. This is just a way to measure what a subset of species would represent in terms of evolution. Why you would choose A, C, and E is going to be context specific. We're going to come back to a particular context.
Yeah, but it serves, if I'm not mistaken, it's supposed to serve to assess which species should be
Preserved.
more preserved or
Yeah.
less. Yeah. But if we focus, for example, on species E more than on species A,
Yes.
we modify selection because
Yes.
extinction of terminal
Yes.
points has different patterns
Yes.
than we.
Oh yeah, we're going to modify. Oh, absolutely. We're engineering the future 100%. We are definitely engineering the future, but we have to get used to that. We're trying to actually.
Yeah, that's the point of the conservation.
That's the point of the conservation is to engineer. Yes, to the extent that we're part of that, to the extent that we're part of nature, this is an engineering exercise. Actually, 100%. This was actually created. This was created a long time ago. This was actually created in the context of trying to decide which parks to produce, which parks to conserve in a country at any scale, as in Australia. So you say, okay, we have money, we're going to conserve this park. Which is the next best park to conserve if we want to conserve this facet of biodiversity? So the idea being, if we have two parks, one that has B and C and one that has B and E, well, given that E is going to increase our phylogenetic diversity more, we should include that piece of land that makes sure that we get E. So it was a complementarity approach initially in terms of choosing bits of land and which species do we capture each time. And if we want to make sure that every time we capture new species, we're trying to optimize that every time we capture new species, we're capturing species that will give us more evolution, as much evolution as possible.
But still, we
Maximize evolution.
but still we may classify species according to how they deserve to be protected,
Yeah.
to follow more evolutionary pattern.
Yes, yes. But completely changes the course of evolution for sure. For sure. No one worries about that. I mean, in this context. Okay. If you look at real trees, as you lose species, this is where you have all the species on a tree, you'll then we have no species on a tree. Even though the trees can have funny shapes, there's generally there's always a monotonic and pretty not really linear, but you know, pretty even relationship between how much of the tree you lose. So as you lose species, you lose the tree, which makes sense. Every time you lose a species, a bit of the tree is going to be pulled out. You're going to lose in evolution, so you're going to lose some proportion of the tree, and it just kind of looks like that. And it's not, you know, it's literally me looking at real trees. Okay, now we're going to try to connect those two, the isolation index and the fact that we're trying to safeguard the tree of life. So remember the IPBS said both things. We want to safeguard the tree of life. This is a good way to measure it. We want to focus on isolated species. Those were the two things that was in that position. So you can just think of something called PD complementarity. It's just any tip's contribution to the tree, right? So A's contribution to the tree is just what it would bring to the tree. So it would bring 2 million years, for instance, of evolution to the tree. So it's just the PD of the whole tree minus the PD of the tree after you remove that species. That's just PD complementarity. That's just a standard measure of complementarity. This is just the age of the species. So that's its PD complementarity, that's C's PD complementarity, and that's E's PD complementarity. It's just the whole tree, how much evolution is there, minus how much evolution there's there. If you don't include the tree, that's how many trees. Okay. So the more distinct you are, probably the more you complement the tree. Because right, if you represent more of the tree, then if you lose it, more of the tree is gone. Does that make sense? So it's a form of, so distinct species, so species that have high distinctness scores should exhibit some form of PD complementarity.
Yeah, so what I would complain about this metric is like, if I imagine like how the tree like develops in time, if there, for example, if there was like a tree with a lot of branches.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know, like, let's say like 9 out of the 10 leaves like died already.
Yeah.
I would intuitively guess the remaining leaf like has like a higher counterfactual value because like kind of the information lost by the species which like already died, like kind of the remaining thing is the like kind of like nearest substitute. So like these metrics don't seem to be sensitive to like kind of like species like already lost. It makes sense. I can draw it on.
Now, we'll draw it now. Sure. If we have cards, yeah.
So I'm imagining something like I don't know, like let's so like I assign some values to the branches, and right now let's assume that like I don't know, like these have all like died.
Yes.
So I would expect like some value of these like kind of be inherited by the remaining.
Well, only this part is inherited by the only the
Yeah, but-
this and this. Only these two pieces are inherited.
Yeah, so
But that's there. That's what's in there. That's exactly what's going on.
that's what's going on here. That
Yeah.
like only this is inherited, but
Yes.
I'm not sure if like part of this shouldn't be also like counted here.
It can't because all that evolution occurred independently. So any mutations that occurred here cannot be here. They can if they're parallel, but the evolution that occurred here is that's what exactly what the tree is telling you is that the evolution that occurred here, all this evolution here, occurred only here and is not accounted for here or here. That's exactly what the tree is telling you. That's the graph. That's the
That's I understand
Okay.
how the graph works. Like
Okay.
my question is like if it's like capturing like what I intuitively care about. If, for example, the leaves are, I don't know, like geographically separate populations,
Yeah.
which kind of
Yeah.
like convergently exert some like the same traits and
Yes.
so on.
Yes, then it's different. But that's now we're talking about that's what you asked me right at the beginning, is that what is it?
Yeah.
What is the information like? What
Yeah.
yes, which I'll give you some data on that in a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. So we can ask, what would A's complement be, not just to the tree as it's static, but to all possible subsets, right? So A, if everything else was gone, this is how much A would contribute to that tree. If there's only A and B around, then A would only contribute this because B is already there and therefore contains all that information, right? That's in common with that. If it's A and C that are left, so B and D are lost, then A would actually contribute this much because C would already be there and it would be redundant, right? So this is all about redundancy. So you can do this for all possible subsets. And then you can take the average, and that could be the average expected contribution of A to that set. Now, if you assume that each subset size was equiprobable, so you're just as likely to get a subset of 1 as a subset of 3, then you would have the Shapley index. So like Shapley got the Nobel Prize for something called the Shapley index, amongst other things. And that Shapley index is indeed exactly that measure of complementarity. It's a game theory. That's just the equation. You just ask what is the complementarity. So we've seen this before, right? The PD of the full tree minus the PD of the tree minus the species that you're looking at. So I already showed you that. And you just have to weight it to make sure that all subset sizes are of equal probability. And this was proven in a number of papers to work. And it was proven that the Shapley index is exactly the fair proportion index. So that simple little fair proportion index of taking the tree and cutting it up and distributing amongst the tips is indeed this particular form of complementarity. It's the expected contribution of a species to all possible subsets going into the future, which means now you can start thinking about extinction and what those possible subsets might be in the future. And if you lose FP, so now you talking about species loss, you say you take a species away and you say, well, how much FP did I lose? And then you ask how much of the tree that you lose, you also get a good positive correlation. This is for model trees. This is for real trees. So this is for all the birds. That's that tree that I showed you, 10,000 species. This is for all the mammals. Well, there's like 6,000 species. All the amphibians, another 5,000 or 6,000 species. And you'll say that as you lose species and you calculate how much FP you've lost, how much isolation you've lost, it's completely linear with how much of the tree you've lost. So FP is actually a pretty good measure of complementarity. And now we know exactly what type of complementarity it is. It's the how much it offers and therefore how much you lose when you have no idea who else is going to be around in the future. So if you really don't know what's going to be around in the future, you can use the Shapley index and you can connect your isolation to this, which is your target, which is to preserve the tree, as much of the tree as possible. For the cognoscenti, for this to generally be the case, high FP species are rarely close relatives, which means you rarely have the situation in life that you've got two species that are themselves each other's really close relatives, but collectively on a really long branch. The tailed frogs are a good counterexample. There are only two species of tailed frogs. They both live in North America. They're closely related to each other, but they have no close relatives. Their closest relatives are in New Zealand, and they're 100 million years. And then that whole group is extremely deep in the tree. So you do have examples of this, but they must be rare for this linear relationship between FP and PD and whole. So that's just an aside. And then the flip side, another sort of observation that's relevant to this connection between FP and PD loss is that some species are expected to be really old. So we calculated that we know how much the average age of a species should be. If you know about the tree, you can calculate sort of the average age of a species. But some mathematicians, applied mathematicians down in New Zealand and Australia worked out that given this, we can actually calculate what we expect the oldest species to be in a tree. It turns out that the oldest species, so this species, there's always going to be one species that's really, really old in the tree, and it's actually expected to be half as old as the group itself. It's actually expected to come down. Nothing like. Remember this is basically 1/2 t if this is t. Right. So for any group you look at, there's going to be one species that contributes a lot. Like, for instance, the panda. That's conservative. I think we don't, in the interest of time, I don't think we have to belabor that, but this is a theoretical expectation. We don't really know what real trees look like, as you all know. But if you look at just what we think from what empirical trees look like, they tend to be even old, the species tend to be even older than you'd expect. And if you just look at the data, if you go back and look at those bird trees and those elm trees, and you look at the proportion age of the oldest species in the particular clade, so this is the LT over T, and I said that the expectation should be about a half. So that's the dotted line here. And you'll see for a lot of different families, especially for the larger families, that's actually the case. Right? Often the oldest species is half the age of the clade, right? About half the time here, and sometimes it's even much higher. That's just for mammals. If you look at amphibians, so again, these are the biggest families where the expectation holds. You'll see that the purple ones all tend to be, pretty much except for here, all tend to be centered around 0.5 here, for instance, and with smaller families as well. So it seems to be a general property. So there are some really old species out there. Okay, and remember I told you that the fair proportion index is actually measured as you get all of your own species age and then a little bit of the rest of the tree. Well, that means that the oldest species is probably the one that also has the highest complementarity. And indeed, over 80% of the time, the oldest species is also the one that has the highest complementarity value, which as you'd expect. This is all just as you might expect looking at empirical trees. So this is just to show that there are trees that are important. There are species that are really important for this complementarity. Flip side of this is that you actually have to know the tree in order to be able to do this. You can't make it up because you don't know which one of the species is going to be that oldest species, right? So if you don't know what the tree is, so let's say you have you know that they're all in the same genus, but you don't know how they're related, you really don't know which one of the species is going to be that one that's the oldest. And so if you don't know the tree, you can't do anything. So that's just the data. Don't worry about the axes, but that's just bigger the size of the group that you're trying to figure things out that you don't know anything about. Doesn't really matter. There's no correlation between the true FP value and the estimated value. You have to know your trees. Okay, that's sort of technical aside. Okay, last part associated with this part of the talk is that I said that this Shapley value was a very specific form of complementarity where actually all the subset sizes are recombinable. Well, that makes no biological sense, right? If you just think about the future, you really don't think that it's just as likely that A is the only member of that clade in the future, then it's everything else remains, or at least a few things remain. So the Shapley value, which wasn't created for this type of game at all, it was a game theory measure that works in the context for which it was created, in the economic situation which was created, but not for this kind of extinction kind of thing. Yes.
It's also super easy to generalize if you like know the likelihood of the scenarios. Like
yes.
It's like weighted by
yes.
the likelihood. So
yes, and that's what we did.
Yeah.
So we just weighted it. We just weighted the subset size by the probability. Where did we get the probability? From the extinction probabilities.
Yeah,
so every species that
that's not a specific thing for biology. It's like
okay,
extremely general thing which you do if you know something about.
Well, so yeah, okay. So the reason that it was interesting for us is that remember FP was created with no knowledge that it was a Shapley.
Yeah.
It was used by the ZSL.
Mm-hmm.
They were calling it an isolation index.
Yeah.
We were able to formalize what that was.
Mm-hmm.
We were able to show that this doesn't make sense, so we have to use a likelihood.
Mm-hmm.
We added in the likelihoods, so it's a function of the probability. So that just came out in 2023. This is just how you do it, which maybe again, if people want to know how to do it, we can talk about it. But you can just weight the branch by the probability that it persists. So you build a fictitious tree instead of the real tree, which is called expected PD tree. So you just weight each branch. So each branch is lambda, weighted by the probability that it actually is going to be around. And then you can calculate the FP of the tree, right? So species that have high probabilities of extinction are not likely to be around, so they don't contribute much. Species that with low probability of extinction are gonna contribute a lot because we do expect them to be around, and so you can calculate the EPD, and then you can do the complementarity on that tree to calculate kind of the extension of the Shapley, And that's what we did. So we just use the expected tree, do the same thing, do the complementarity. The thing is, funny thing is, and this is the interesting sort of, I was just in Copenhagen talking to philosophers about how science works. So we did this way back in 2007. It was only in 2023, well, starting in 2024, that the ZSL decided not to use this measure of complementarity, but to use this heightened sort of more sophisticated version of complementarity. So that's how we now rank species. So that's how the existence program is using. We're using expected PD based on nominal probability extinction of everybody else out there. Okay, so conclusions from part two. Remember, part three is very short, so you'll make it to lunch. When we lose species, we lose evolutionary history. Simple measure of species complementarity is this particular one, which is historically the one that was used. It relates, these two things are directly related, which is good. There's lots of variation because species differ a lot in age, and this complementarity is very much weighted towards species ages. So lots of latitude to prioritize. You need good, I rushed over that, but you need good phylogenetic trees to do that. And this can be extended in a straightforward manner for more conservation related measures of complementarity. And that's what's being done. Okay, so that was all symmetrics. Okay, stretch, look around, have a cup, have a glass, have some cookies or something. Then we'll quickly go through the last part. Okay. Okay, why are we and the IPBS concerned with conserving evolutionary history anyway? What are we actually trying to conserve? Well, maybe the more trees you have, the more solved problems you have. So remember, what's around now is what's succeeded to solve the evolutionary problems. Otherwise, they'd be extinct, right? So you think of evolution as being an accumulation of solved problems. And this is Wayne Madison who came up with this idea of thinking about it. So more tree, more solved problems. Why do we care about solved problems? Well, maybe those solutions are good for something for humans. So species that contribute more to phylogenetic diversity have high, let's call them high isolation scores, have higher option value, not exactly the way that the economists refer to option value, but in the same sphere, because they're more likely to embody features that aren't found elsewhere. Remember, because they don't. If you're isolated, then you have a lot of evolution that you don't share with other species, and therefore you have solved problems that other species don't share with you. So what are features? 23 things you didn't know you wanted. So this is a set of slides that didn't translate because we switched to PDF. But these are just things that currently you wouldn't know that you need, but you might need in the future, like an inflatable tie. The classic example of this is this. So that is a baby frog coming out of its mother's stomach. So these are real bacteria called the gastric rooting frogs. There are two species in their own subfamily. Both of them have, they're related. Both of them have this property that she could turn off her stomach. So she would lay eggs, they'd be fertilized. She'd turn her stomach off. She'd scoop up the eggs, put them in her stomach, like literally the stomach, the same stomach that she usually eats things with. They would grow in there. They would hatch, and then she'd pop out little tadpoles. They would just pop out of her mouth. People thought, wow, they could figure out the genes that are associated with turning off the gastric juices in the stomach. You could maybe, like Ozempic, you could probably make a lot of money if you could sort of figure out how she actually did that. Both of those species are extinct. So the option value there was lost. Now, this is completely post hoc, but this is often trotted out as being, oh my gosh, if we had known that, remember, these are the only two species in that subfamily. So they were isolated on a long branch. They were on a long branch. They had a lot of evolution. Part of that evolution led to this property. Gone. So that's option value loss. The Hoatzin, remember I said it was the only ruminating bird, and indeed, the Department and Joint Genome Institute, when they first said that they were going to sequence the entire genome, and they also want a sequence of microbial communities in that crop, et cetera, because they are hoping that there'll be novel enzymes that could be used for biofuel, right? So there's something that bird has that has maybe has solved a problem, and maybe that's a value for us. So what? Okay, now question is, does the tree capture? Does it predict those features? So we can show when it does perfectly, but we can sort of show, theoretically when we'd expect the tree to do a good job, tree measured in time. And these are the sort of properties that those traits have to have. Low enough rate that they each arise once and is never lost, except there isn't a lot of that evolution towards the same solution. And if that's the case, then the branch lengths perfectly predict the number of features that fall along. Okay, if we know which features we want to conserve, we don't need to worry about it. But if we don't know, then can we use the tree to predict? So we take the time tree. So again, time is now on this axis. That represents the actual evolutionary history. And then we take a bunch of traits and we ask, well, how well does the tree predict those traits? Like, right, what is the correlation between trees and traits? And what we did in a couple of papers here, and these are papers that came out of that working group that I told you about. We looked at a particular class of traits, and those are functional traits. Those are ecologically functional traits. So this was not gastric brooding frogs or microbiomes. This was traits that are associated with interacting with your environment, right? So it's like what you eat, where you live, how big you are. These are what are referred to as functional traits. Diet, body size, foraging activity, cycle, foraging height, etc., etc. So we did this for birds. We did this for fish, coral reef fish, etc., etc. And here's the PD performance. So all we're asking here, this family, my family, what we're asking here is how well does the tree do at capturing those functional traits relative to we just chose species at random. So we choose the same number of species. This is over different, but you say you choose 10% of the species. You say, well, how many functional traits do I get? Then you just choose 10 species at random. You say, how many functional traits do I get? If the tree is a good record of solved problems, and those problems are those functional traits, then the PD should do better than random. And as you see, it does better than random, but lots of scatter, right? Both birds and mammals and for fish. And the underappreciated fact is that there are multiple ways to get sets that are the same functional diversity. Or sorry, it's the same phylogenetic diversity, same amount of evolution. Many possible sets that are they capture equal amounts of evolution, because for any given pair of species, you can choose this one or this one, you get the same amount of evolution, right? So there's lots of latitude here. Remember, you don't know what you're looking for, you're just choosing. And almost a third of those sets are worse than random. So you can find a max set where the tree does well, but you can find an equally rich set of species that contains just as much evolution, but actually does worse than random. So for functional traits, our contention is that the PD doesn't do a particularly good job. Doesn't meet those criteria, right? That we should be conserving. That's using PD. You could also just look at isolation directly. You say, okay, let's just look at how distinct a species is, and just look at, and you can just say, well, how distinct are its features? How different is it from everything? Right? So I told you about a Watson. It's very different on that one trait, right? In terms of having a gut. I told you about the gastric brooding frog, where that one trait is very different from everything else. What if you just take a whole bunch of traits? Whole bunch. You can ask what's the relationship between those two. So we did the same, didn't have all, these are all just North American birds. We took a whole bunch of different, again, functional traits. And we asked, what's the correlation? And the correlation is not there. No correlation between distinctiveness and feature distinctiveness. There's your Watson out there, definitely distinct, most distinct, right? In terms of distinctness, in terms of where it is on the tree, but not particularly distinct if you just look at a bunch of traits. Again, if you look, you can find traits that we know why, because it's weird in that way, but it's not generally weird. Do the same thing for mammals. Again, there's nothing. So for ecologically relevant traits, the tree is probably not a good predictor. Okay, what about human use? Well, we can do those. I haven't done those tests, but you can ask yourself, is it true that if you use the tree and you choose species that give you a lot of the tree, are you more likely to get something that's useful to humans currently? Like medicine or biofuel or cultural uses or whatever. So you can do exactly the same kind of comparison. You take a bunch of, you get a bunch of features, a bunch of human use now. This is only been done for plants so far. You take a bunch of species at random, see how much you get, or you use your tree to get as much evolution as possible, and then see if you get more of these traits. And you do. So this is how much of the tree you sample. This is if you use the tree that you sort of maximize evolution. You say how many plant-based records, how many records do you get? And this is if you do it randomly. And it is significant. But the effect size is actually quite moderate. But this is the best evidence. This is for PD. For FP, it's much weaker. But for the tree, there is some evidence. This suggests that if current uses are also, if the pattern of current use on the tree is predictive of the pattern of future use on the tree, then PD may have some, this whole framework that the IPBS is suggesting may have some relevance. Okay, but this is where current use, you have to make the connection that current uses predicts future uses. And scientifically, that's hard to do. I don't know. So we're still trying to figure out if we can come up with if anyone's got some good ideas how you could test future use versus using data on current use, like if there's some fancy way to think about it, then I'd love to hear about it. So we could do this kind of test again. Okay, so.
Well, I mean, of this ways have you tested this, like, take, like, uses till, let's say, like, 1970, kind of the pattern, and then, like, kind of, like, if you know, like, from which point of time, like.
Yes, yeah, for new uses, yeah. So we were, yes. But a lot of these uses are not, these biological uses are not, well, maybe for medicine.
For medicine, like, it's probably like any sort of like patented or something.
Yeah. So this is about, if you consider what we know most about that where we're getting new uses would be, for instance, from medicines, right? But I did go to a conference about a decade ago where they invited a senior chemist who does this kind of prospecting. I ran a huge lab in Cambridge or somewhere, and his whole talk was that there's generations amount of work to be done with any slug, any single slug that you could pull out of your garden in terms of getting new bioactive compounds, that you did not have to go and worry about anything. Don't even have to go to the tropics. He's like, he can go to his backyard, picks up a slug, and they can work for a generation. There's so many bioactive compounds just in a slug, any slug. And so his argument was that it was completely overselling this idea that we have to somehow predict where all these new compounds are going to come from, and that somehow evolution was going to tell us just purely from the medical point of view. That's one person's perspective, but he was invited to give this talk, and that's what he said. So everyone's like, oh, okay, maybe that's not the argument we should be using for conservation. So to end, species are more or less distinct lineages. They might have utility of their own. They might know about it. Interestingly, having more species on the landscape might be indicative that the landscape's doing well. So one of the questions I had when I was first starting out was, why do we have endangered species legislation in the first place? And what I was told from conservation biologists that if you can make sure species are not at risk on the landscape, that means you're managing the landscape well. So they're a metric for the landscape conservation, for the matrix. So they're not valuable in and of themselves, they're only valuable as an indicator of what you're doing for the rest of the whole sort of ensemble. So they would be a metric. My two observations are, well, if they're a metric, why are we given such a central place? And why would Soule say they have this intrinsic value if really they're just a metric for something else that has some other value? So nature is more than a warehouse. So as philosophers have pointed out that we shouldn't think of nature as something we should take from, and that these species are just these things that give us features. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But my second puzzle is I'm not sure people really care about species. I'm not sure they care about species as products of adaptive evolution in terms of the tree. I'm not sure they care about them as fertilizer for future evolution. If you think about this component part and making sure that evolution can happen and all that stuff. And I'm not even sure, there's a whole pile of slides here I've missed out, but about this idea that they're cogs in an ecosystem. This is the whole argument about more species, better ecosystem services, which we know is fairly shaky, right? at the whole biodiversity ecosystem function, the literature, very, very short. We need very few species for ecosystems to function. But rather, what they care about is what they saw as a child. They want to have the species around them that they remember and then that they know about, and the species that are just in their particular place. There's some evidence for that. So we've done some surveys that show that people care more about the species in their own area than about species in general. But to the extent that that is correct, then our value, all this, everything I've talked about, just about everything I've talked about today, is not really what society cares about. And so this idea that species have value in themselves, blah, 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 may not actually be capturing the whole problem. And this, which is mostly intrinsic value, right? So Soule is arguing for intrinsic value. This has been augmented by Kai Chan, amongst others, to capture something that they refer to as relational value, which finds value not in species, but in certain populations of certain species for certain people in certain places. And what I value, and I call them the species that I know, are going to be very different from what you value and what you value. And certainly what people living somewhere else in a different environment might value. And I think this is really good. So I think this is really where there's now a new journal about relational value. This is just trying to try to figure out how can we incorporate this idea of relational value into this key.
I think those things are actually quite in some like philosophical tension.
Yes, I
Like
agree.
the first thing like claims,
Yeah.
like there is some like intrinsic value.
Yep.
I think like if you kind of like start from the first sentiment and like try to like kind of like refine it, I would guess if you like extrapolate it, like you would arrive at something like valuing the history of the evolutionary process.
And when people say that, they do. Yeah.
And
So
I
why?
think the argument, like kind of like how is it like related to public values or something like it's an extrapolation. If the people like, okay, people like see some nice animals as kids, but like most people haven't spent like a lot of time like thinking about what they actually live and so on and so on. So I think the second one, like kind of like the second thing kind of like tries to ground
Yes.
things in like people's
Yes.
preferences.
This is just felt preference. This is all about
just like
self-preference.
preference.
This is a felt preference. They know that. Kai Chan says it's actually a felt preference.
Yeah.
But it's trying, because you're talking to conservation biologists, he's trying to get conservation biologists to think about that and not start thinking like other people. Trying to get conservation biologists to start thinking like other people instead of just thinking like conservation biologists who have all this training and have this, all these all these other ideas.
Yeah, and also on the other hand, the conservation biologist can like explain to other people like the preferences are like
It's re-engineering your answer. Nice.
Sorry?
It's re-engineering.
Re-engineering people's, it's re-engineering people's.
Yeah, it's happening all the time. Like our preferences are mostly given by cultural evolutionary process.
But actually, I was thinking that the goal of nature protection is to eliminate impact of people, not to.
That's an old goal. No, that's I think that's changed. That's changed. Yeah. So if you read Inheritors of the Earth by Chris Thomas, has anyone read that book? I don't know if people, fantastic book about the Anthropocene and how the new goal is actually to engineer a world that works for us. Do what you want. And we have to figure out what's important. But it is not to pull, and the whole, I mean, it doesn't work here because you guys are all indigenous, but if you go to the new world, where Westerners are not indigenous, then the indigenous people will tell you that they've been engineering their environment forever. And this idea that you're supposed to, this is the whole tension about pulling people out of parks, right? Which in India and Africa and everywhere, like that's just crazy from the point of view of the people who are there. Like we're part of, we are engineering. We are really good beavers. Like we are engineering the environment and we should be engineering the environment. So that's a little bit old. That's sort of a Rachel Carson. That's kind of a post-war kind of idea about what Aldo Leopold, like that's a whole way of thinking about conservation that is shifting quite a bit and has to, because we're going to have to intervene more and more.
Yeah, but it depends whether it is by effect we are aware of or if it's intentional.
No, I mean, we have to intentionally, the idea is that we have to be intentional about how we're going to interact with the environment. I mean, That's just me saying that, but that's my view of the way it's going. Okay. The morning's done. Thank you very much. This is the recap. This is not what is prioritized. We can do it, the safeguard, we can do it if we have a tree. If we want an argument for why we're doing it, we should really think about what types of features are we talking about. And I think that's an open question. And information content is another one that we haven't tackled, but we could. And as a bracket, because I didn't really get into it, because the whole thing about instrumental and intrinsic and relational value and different perspectives, but it may be that even though the IPBS is saying that this is really important, we should really think about what other axis of value may be relevant to the people that pay us. Okay. That's the longest talk I've ever given in my entire life. So thank you for the opportunity. Be good about it. And I'll put it back there, I guess. Is that, yeah. We good timing? All right, 30 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Any thoughts from the back? Yes. Yes.
So when we have two related species and one is endangered,
Yes.
and one have a good population.
Yes.
Which is for which we put the money for which is
Yes.
good.
Yes.
Have good population or
Right.
which bad population.
Right. Currently, always the bad. Whether that's whether that's actually rational, I mean, it's rational, but whether that is the right value to have is a discussion in the literature. Yeah, 100%. But currently, it's always because it's always, and a lot of money. And it turns out the probability of doing better increases the worse you get. So we've done an analysis that shows the rate at which you move. So the red list has different categories. You can be called least concerned, or you can be vulnerable, or you can be threatened, or you can be endangered, or you can be critically endangered, right? And critically endangered means you're on the brink of going extinct. Turns out that the probability of going from vulnerable to threatened, or from threatened to endangered, is higher than going from critically endangered to extinct. And you're more likely to be critically endangered to move up to get better, because at that only then do the millions of dollars get poured into trying to protect those last 20. So you kind of quickly move into this critically endangered, and then you either sit there or you get better, because we'll do anything to keep that population from going extinct. So all the money gets piled up way too late, because it's way more expensive. Yeah.
So the rating of this branch are for what? When we always put the money for the most danger.
Yes. There's two ways in which that probability comes into play. One is where you calculate which species are most important, because species that have relatives that are at high risk of endangerment become more important because they're more likely to persist, and the other ones are more likely to go. So they're given higher weight because they are more likely to carry information that we want to maintain. And then in the way that it's being done now, you then multiply that by its own probability of extinction. And then if that probability of extinction is high, that's even more important to conserve it. So it comes in sort of twice. Just wait. Anything else from the back here and then here?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about the area of life.
Yes.
Have you been talking about protecting it or conserving it? I mean, in the example you gave in the beginning about polar bears breeding with grizzlies.
Yes.
So if I want to protect the area of life,
Yes.
should I encourage them to breed or prevent them from breeding? Where does it fit in? To understand what you really mean by protecting the area of life, therefore the evolutions and.
Yes. So the way that it's been, I don't think I made a judgment on which one to do.
Yeah.
The way that people have been thinking about it is about conserving the tree of life, therefore conserving the past products of the tree of life, not conserving the opportunity for it to continue. So it's definitely looking back. So if you want to look back, you keep them separate, because you want to make sure all those genes, the ones in the polar bear and the ones in the grizzly bear, are retained. If you know that the polar bear and the grizzly bear are both at risk of extinction, which on the long scale probably is true, it's very hard to live with grizzly bears. It's just, there's only so much room on the earth. Grizzly bears and polar bears are both things that we're probably not going to want to have around as we have more and more people. Then breeding them together would people argue, would give a better chance for that ensemble to persist. So then you would be happy if they interbred. That would be more of a forward-looking perspective. Currently, in the same way that we spend all our time thinking about the most endangered species, we are also generally more concerned with protecting the past products of evolution, not the expected future of evolution. But that's an active, you're kind of right at the edge of the way people are thinking. But it's really hard for people to do this projection. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, partly, I think.
Partly? Oh, sorry. Yes, maybe.
Has there been any like discussions that the AUCN or something was included in the dimensional integrity?
Yes, there is a species specialist. There's a group that has put forward proposals to incorporate evolutionary heritage or evolutionary distinctiveness and stuff in their thinking. But it's, I mean, all they do is ask whether something is at risk or not at risk. So they're not sure exactly how to incorporate it. But there is a working group thinking about how they might do it. But they don't do any prioritization really. They just go through to say whether it's at risk or not. Right. So it's one step removed from
Yeah, I just meant
Yeah.
like now that they've got the green list.
Yes, exactly.
So
Yes,
that's-
in the context of the green list, this is and KBA and all that sort of stuff. Yes, they are actively thinking about it. But you need good trees, and so sorry.
Most of your talk and comment very on the information.
Yes.
Evolutionary
Yes.
aspect, which is sort of information that is hidden or coded in the DNA,
Yes.
in the nucleus. So why the hell we are taking care of the animals or plants if we could take the nuclei, freeze them and store them for future and forget about the entities that have this nuclei with the information with the long evolutionary stuff inside, and they are retaliating the function because they need to replicate, they need to eat something, they need some stuff.
Yeah.
Why not to limit these theories on the genetic income, on the genomes, and store, protect
Right.
genomes for any future application? Maybe in a couple of decades, we will be able to clone anything very easily. So this would be your future prospect. So
Yep.
why not to do this?
I'm not stopping anybody from doing that. I think the argument has always been that the translation from genotype to phenotype is still so we still don't understand it enough, and that's why we can't use genomic information as a direct measure of what we want to conserve. Like someone suggested, why don't you use some sort of what's it called? Compaction algorithm to try to figure out, like how much information is there and how much is shared
So
information.
they would like kind of like intuitive, kind of coming from like information theory perspective, like why not like measure the
Information content, because we
Information
can't, that's the thing, there's no good way to take a whole genome and get the information content and get the shared information content between them because of all the regulatory elements, and there's a lot of geometric information in the genome that isn't captured in any of those information content metrics that we know about. But if we could, that'd be a great way to bypass time and something else. But anyway, people have suggested, and they do. I mean, the seed banks do try to capture as wide a range as possible to get as much of a tree as possible, to get as much information as possible. But why not go to the genome directly? I think it's because we don't believe that we understand what how that is coded. Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
but at the same time, all these.
It is about information, yeah.
Are based.
100%, 100%. Yep, 100%. And so it seemed logical. That's the way we should go. I agree with you. Okay, sorry. I got up. Yes.
Yes, nice talk. And you show all examples on animals. And I wonder for all time, if does it work considering plants? Because most evolution concerning plants is
Yes.
hybridization,
Yes.
polypluralization,
Yes.
and processes like this.
Yes.
And I wonder if the concepts and the cultivation methods works also for plants.
Yes. Great question. So that's the reason we don't use plants, because the trees are really bad for plants because they're not particularly tree-like. A lot of the metrics can be applied to networks with some tweaks, and so the applied mathematicians have been busy doing that to make sure that they can translate. But we don't even know what those networks look like yet, and so we can't use them as examples. So 100% This is all large animals that have supposedly good, where the trees kind of look like that, where you have networks.
But the concept itself.
Concept will work.
works
Yeah,
also
concept
for-
will work, and the math, most of the math works as well, 100%. But it's harder.
Yeah.
You can imagine, right? They're not greedy algorithms. A lot of this can be done with greedy algorithms. Can't use greedy algorithms when you got networks. There's other sort of.
And I asked
Yeah.
plants, but what about considering lichens or other?
Well, again, conceptually should work. Operationalizing is going to take some place, I think.
Like shipley value is like extremely general concept and
Yeah.
expected
It's
value is
a-
like extremely general concept.
Mm.
So like you can kind of like calculate expected value of like kind of like expected.
Yeah, you need expected values. Exactly.
Expected values of like shipley values on like literally
Mhm.
like
Any-
almost anything. So it has like a
But
very
there's
good like
Three,
theoretical
but
boundaries.
It's not a tree, but there's some sort of network.
It doesn't matter. You can
Yeah.
like calculate shipley values of like CS members to like
Yeah.
I don't know.
But you do need units, so you need helpful units. Okay, just anybody else in the back, just because you had another question? Oh, yeah, Antonin, and then back, yeah. And then,
You mentioned at the beginning that there are these different concepts of the wildlife species.
Yes.
like the component
Yes,
populations,
yes.
and nation species. And I'm wondering, like, what is your position? And being in that committee, making those decisions for Canada, like, how do those discussions unfold? What is that?
yeah, well, I did say, yeah, those are both really good questions. So to answer your first one, my intuition is that the nascent lineage one is better, but both because it's slightly easier to operationalize for the first. Second, I think it better meets the mandate of a national legislation. So all we care about are lineages in Canada, and the geographic component should be taken care of by other jurisdictions. So they become conservation units, management units, but not biological units. So it's an order, because what's been happening in Canada is we've been using us as biologists to actually try to do conservation, right? When I showed the little group over here and said, oh, if you don't recognize it, it's going to go extinct. Well, that's a management issue. That's not a biological issue. So I'm on the nascent lineage sort of camp. Cognizant that, but only in the ideal world where there are other actors that will deal with other aspects of biodiversity, like what's in your place where you live. And if you want to keep that, then you have to conserve that. But don't use endangered species legislation to do that work. So how do they unfold? In a very interesting manner. So I think that's something over beer and I can describe, but it is a consensus-based 2/3. You have to vote 2/3 in favor. So there's about 50 of us, maybe no, there's only 30 votes, about 60 people at the table, but 30 votes, and you need 2/3 majority for anything to pass. And there's a lot, and there's a lot of mixing of science and conservation thinking in those deliberations, and some that's explicit and some that's implicit. And so biologists are being asked, those scientists are being asked to make decisions that they shouldn't be asked to make because they're conservation decisions. It's better if the conservation biologists came to us and say, this is what we want. What science, what does the science say about this? How, what's the best way to do this? What are the genetic patterns, whatever. But we're being asked upfront to make decisions about units that have conservation implications, but we're not doing the conservation biology. So it's a little bit of a cart before the horse, which causes a lot of tension. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Back, yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I like everything. So I would like to ask about one of the philosophical questions at the very end of it's like basically the question, what is going to protect
Yes.
or conserve image?
Yes.
And apparently it is not easy, it is very complex to get to this point. But there must be tons of sociological research that just ask this question to people, what they want to do in terms of.
Yeah, you know what? No, you'd be surprised. It's very difficult. It's no, I would have thought the same thing, but there isn't as much as you would think. Just asking people. But when you do ask people, they very rarely talk about things in the abstract and they talk about things in the concrete. They want to have nature parks, they want to have pretty things. A lot of it is aesthetic. And a lot of them want what they had as children. So the way that it used to be. So there's lots of nostalgia. But a lot of it is local. And a lot of it, of course, is, and they've done this test, they did this test, the whole series of these tests. Of course, the more information you give people, the more they become interested in something. And we know that as to be a fact. So you can engineer people to be interested in almost anything if you just make it exciting and tell them about it. And people love novelty, right? There's a whole philosophical thing about how rare species are valuable because they're novel. You're not likely to see them. So if you see them, it's the first time you see them. That's why people go to zoos. You're like, well, wow, because we actually like novelty. That's why we collect coins, so it sits in that whole psychological sphere of novelty and surprise. So that's an aspect as well. But to my mind, there's less than you would think about being able to predict what people actually want, which is kind of weird, unfortunate. So, sorry, yeah, he's doing, yeah.
But you can protect the objects of aesthetics and nostalgia, isn't it?
You can protect those objects, yeah, no, but then you have to define them. But you'd be surprised that we don't need very many, right? Most biodiversity people never see. I mean, people have done that study a lot, where you change the amount of biodiversity in a place, and then you ask people how much they actually noticed, and you'll see that it's an order of magnitude, you double the amount of biodiversity and they see 5% more. Like people don't really, they love complexity, but it asymptotes pretty fast. You just need a bunch of things, but that's all you need. Way less than what we got, right? So most of it's superfluous from the study.
I think in reality, in Czech Republic, we mostly protect the objects of aesthetics.
Yeah.
And the biodiversity is there, but not so strong.
It comes along.
In practice.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah. Okay, anyway, it's noon, so I don't know what, I'm happy to keep talking, I just don't want to keep people if people want to go, but yeah.
There is less species in the Arctic area than in the, and the nature is always more sensitive to disturbances in the Arctic area than in South area. It's more sensitive to, isn't it? It can be easily.
I don't know about the first is true. I don't know.
The ecological mechanism.
I don't know about the second. I'm not an Arctic biologist.
But just my question. I am wondering whether the priorities of conservation are different in the South and in the Arctic.
It could be, yes. I think to the extent that they're very different systems, and one is much more depauperate than the other, and it wouldn't surprise me if that should be true and if it were true.
Because I can imagine that in Arctic area, we should focus more on the mechanism, ecological mechanism, than in South, isn't it?
Because it's a simpler system and easier to, That's really interesting. Yeah.
And so what's the differences between protection?
Nothing protected in the Arctic because we haven't done as much damage yet, right? All the damage is in the south. All the endangered species are on islands or in the south. Most of the things that we were going to damage in the temperate and northern, we've already done it a long time ago because we've been here, and so most of those things are already extinct. So everything here is pretty resilient, right? The Mediterranean is the most resilient ecosystem in the world because everything that was going to go extinct is already gone. So everything that's there is just fine. So it's twisted, right? It's backwards. So where you have fewer endangered species is where you've had the most impact historically. So it's kind of weird.
Thank you, Arne. Thank you, everyone. I guess it's noon, so we should possibly move the rest of the discussion forward.